We are going to start now. I'm going to hand over to Alison Garnham, who is the Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, who was previously the Chief Executive Officer of the Daycare Trust and has also been a welfare rights advisor. Alison's going to speak to us tonight about poverty in general, child poverty in particular, and key structural barriers driving inequality for families. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that great introduction. I'm also a Hackney resident. I lived here for 23 years, so we're all friends and neighbours, I hope. What I'm going to do is to talk just briefly about what's happening to child poverty in the UK today. Lots of numbers will flash before your eyes, and I'm hoping that these slides will be made available to people afterwards so people don't think they have to take notes. Is that right? Okay, so don't worry about making notes. So the first thing to say is that in the recent work we did with End Child Poverty with Professor Donald Hirsch from Loughborough University, we found out that Hackney has the second highest rate of child poverty across the UK. This is looking at evidence based on how many people claim tax credits and benefits and so on. So second only to Tower Hamlets with the highest rate of child poverty. I know that there's some evidence that child poverty rates have been coming down in Hackney and that there's big differences between different wards in Hackney, but nevertheless, the figures are high, and these figures are for 2013, so they're a bit more recent than the ones in the Hackney Council's own needs assessment. And child poverty is very expensive. It costs the country something like £29 billion a year, and if you translate that to Hackney, it's about £199 million a year. So it's an expensive business, keeping people in poverty. I want to talk about what's happening in the UK because I think it's very relevant to what's happening all across the country and specifically here. In the UK, we saw the largest reductions in child poverty in the OECD between the mid-1990s and 2008. Child well-being improved, deprivation levels fell, and we know that extra spending on vegetables, children's clothing and books, spending on alcohol and cigarettes fell, although we might need to explain this to a few government ministers possibly. And it wasn't just to do with the introduction of tax credits and increases in benefits, it was also to do with an increase in parental employment. Lone parent employment alone rose from 45 to 57%, and according to the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that accounted for a quarter of the fall in child poverty we saw over that period. The number of children with no qualifications fell, the number of children on free school meals getting qualifications rose. If we'd have continued on that trajectory, we'd have followed the green line down, and we would have hit our child poverty target, which is getting child poverty down to 10% just after 2020. But we haven't gone there. Instead, what's happening now is that we're going to be following the red line. We're about to see a big rise in child poverty, and I'm going to try and explain a bit why. We've seen a big rise in the cost of living. Inflation has risen 19% since 2008 and 2014. The minimum cost of living, as worked out on a minimum income standard, has risen by 28%. Childcare costs alone have risen by 42%, but wages have risen by only 9%. So the cost of a child is going up. It's gone up at least 8% since 2012. And the help people get with bringing up children has gone down. Child benefit has lost about 15% of its value since 2010. It now covers only about 19% of the cost of a child. And a couple who both work full-time on the national minimum wage only earn enough to cover about 82% of the cost of a child. So there's a shortfall between what people are earning and what they need in order to provide a minimum standard of living for their children. And of course, one of the things contributing to child poverty rates is, of course, the massive cuts that have taken place. 80 billion of cuts through the austerity programme, and 22 billion of those just to benefits and tax credits each year. I won't go through in detail. Some of you will be familiar with what they are. This chart here was prepared by the House of Commons Library, and it shows how the cuts are made up. The column on the right is for this year, 2014-15, And what it shows is that the biggest savings are being made by the way that benefits are being uprated. So benefits are rising much more slowly than the general cost of living, if you like, sort of simple way of describing it. And that's where the biggest savings are coming. The next biggest savings are coming from the cuts to tax credits and then child benefit. So one of the things we can say about these cuts is we know that about 70% of the cuts are landing on families with children, and about 60% of them are affecting working families. So these are benefits claimed largely by working families. So this is what's happened to child poverty since the 1970s. You see the gradual increase through the 1980s and into the 1990s, gradual falling. There's two different lines, don't worry about that. The one we're interested in is the green line. That's the one that is being followed by the government's child poverty target. And what we're about to see is this rise at the end, this red line. That's the projections that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have now made about what's going to happen to child poverty from now on. These are the figures about the child poverty target. This middle column is the one we're interested in. What it shows is that in the first year of the child poverty strategy in '98, child poverty was 3.4 million. It fell after 10 years to 2.3 million. So there was a fall by 2010 of about 1.1 million children in poverty. And what we expect to see, and what the IFS has projected, is that that level will then rise again by 2020 to 3.2 million. So another million children will go back into poverty. So almost the same number that came out in the first 10 years of the strategy are expected to go back into poverty in the second 10 years of the strategy. The other thing that's happened that's really worth noting is that since 2000, the way that children in poverty are kind of made up has changed. So it's now the case that whereas it was half and half children living in out-of-work families to children living in working families, it's now the case that 2/3 of poor children live with working parents. So poverty is more and more a characteristic of working families and not out-of-work families. And the EMAS cap that's been proposed by the coalition after 2015 would kind of institutionalise this kind of bearing down on the values of benefits and tax credits. Labour also is proposing a similar EMAS cap, and we know from party conferences that there are more cuts to benefits and tax credits coming down the line. And this is what the net result of it is. Don't get frightened by this chart. This is a chart that's produced at every budget and spending review in the Treasury's own documents. So the middle line is nothing happening to your income. If you go above the line, you're getting better off. If you go below the line, you're getting worse off. The column on the far left-hand side is the poorest 10% of the population. So this is the income distribution, so household incomes. Poorest 10% on the left, richest 10% on the right. So what this shows is that as a result of all the changes to benefits and tax credits, 4 out of 5 people in the bottom half of the income distribution are worse off, and 4 out of 5 in the top half of the income distribution are better off. The people who seem to have done really badly are the top 10% who've had a big hit. But the LSE produced a reworking of this chart last week, because they were concerned that this chart includes some measures that were pre the coalition in May 2010. So there were tax cuts that happened before coalition came into power. So their chart looks like this. And what this shows is that the full half, bottom half of the income distribution is worse off, and the full top half of the income distribution is better off. The people taking a hit at the very top are people earning over £100,000. So this is really concerning. It's obvious that the weight of austerity cuts hasn't fallen on those with the broadest shoulders. It's fallen on those with the narrowest shoulders. So this is where we sit sort of internationally. These are all the European 27 countries. We're kind of bang in the middle. But what I want to say about that is to unpick that a bit. Here's another frightening chart. The little blue dots show you those child poverty rates again. The little boxes up above are what the child poverty rates are before the benefit and tax credit system kicks in. And you'll see there's two very high ones, and that's the UK and Ireland. So the UK and Ireland have the highest child poverty rates in Europe before our tax and benefit system kicks in. So we get to this kind of average position because of what we're doing because of our tax and benefit system. So if you're going to take money out of that, obviously you're going to increase poverty rates. So my miserable message for you this evening is that we're facing a child poverty crisis. We're going to see a rise of 1 million children in poverty and an even higher rise in absolute terms, in terms of people's income falling in real terms. And we know what that means. We've seen it before. It means we steal away children's life chances. It means poor children do worse in education, they have worse health, they're likely to have lifelong limiting illnesses, they're more likely to die younger, be killed on the road, they're going to feel badly about themselves, have low self-esteem, and it costs us a fortune to do this to them. It costs us £29 billion a year in public spending to respond to child poverty. And if it goes up by 1 million, as is forecast, that cost goes up to 35 billion. So basically, I feel children are being made the brunt of austerity. The government often talks about austerity being needed to protect children in the future, to protect future generations. But we don't seem to be showing much concern about the current generation of children who are experiencing these cuts in their living standards. And I don't see why that's justified in a country as wealthy as ours. So what can local authorities do? This is the $64,000 question. Local authorities don't hold the main levers. They don't run the tax and benefit system. They can't shift all these things that are going on to benefits and tax credits and so on. But there are some issues that are better dealt with at local level, where local authorities can intervene. And up and down the country, local authorities have been running fairness commissions, they've been running child poverty commissions, and lots of really good ideas have come out of these. And I've tried to kind of gather some of these together from the ones that I've looked at. So most of them do things like addressing local employment, local housing, trying to create more affordable housing, looking at childcare, looking at educational attainment. They also look at transport and infrastructure projects because in many areas getting people to jobs or jobs to people is one of the biggest problems in their local area. There's also been local authorities looking at low-cost travel for young people. Lots of them, in fact all of them I think, have looked at living wage. And this isn't just in relation to local authorities paying a living wage, it's also being often proposed that the local authority should use its commissioning and tendering processes to insist on living wage in organisations that it funds or gives contracts to. Universal free school meals is one of the big successes. 6 authorities introduced universal free school meals, and as a result, it was evaluated and discovered that having universal free school meals increased educational attainment, but only in the areas where it was universal. So this has actually brought about a change in national government policy. So that shows how local authorities can actually lead the debate sometimes by providing the evidence that's needed. Some local authorities have extended the free entitlement to early education. Camden has 25 hours for example, which is more than the national 15 hours. And some of them have looked at developing local educational maintenance allowances to replace the ones that were abolished. And then looking at families, local authorities already have a lot of responsibilities for childcare in early years. They have sufficiency duties in the Childcare Act, so a lot of them have looked at how they can make sure there's enough childcare for parents, improving the quality, because only high quality will lead to better outcomes for children, protecting Sure Start, trying to get good levels of development at age 5. Other commissions have looked at extended schools, the school as a community resource, and extending the hours so that it allows more parents to work. This is particularly crucial in London, and I've mentioned parental employment here. In London, mothers, there's about an 11% gap between how many mothers in London are able to work compared to mothers outside of London. And that's because it's very hard to get part-time work, and it's very hard to make the sums add up because of additional costs like transport and housing and so on. So lots of councils are thinking about becoming a time-wise council. So just in the ways you do for living wage, you insist on the availability of job share, part-time jobs, decent quality jobs in your borough. You also insist on it in people tendering and commissioning. Employment support to help parents get jobs is something that arguably is much better offered at local level. I was on the Bristol Commission, and their business in the community were running a scheme with ex-homeless young men and getting a much better retention rate in employment than anything like, much better than the government's work programme, for example. So some of these things, it seems, do a lot better at local level. And there's people looking at the local gender pay gap, looking at being compliant for providing employment for disabled people. And I thought poverty-proofing the school day, I think this is a really important one. It's still the case that lots of children who are on low incomes find that they miss out. They're embarrassed by having to stand in different queues for free school meals. It still goes on. Even the local authorities that have smart cards, you can still tell it's them because it pings up on the till. You can tell the amount is a child on a free school meal. But it's not just things like that and school trips and uniforms. It's also children not choosing the courses they want because they're more expensive. And this is something that came out of a study that we did talking to young people, which I found really shocking. And then there's ways of responding to what's happening to family incomes, looking at the fact that poor families often spend more on items in their local communities, and the inflation rate is actually higher for low-income families because the items that most of their money is spent on are the items that are rising the fastest, like food and fuel and so on. So all sorts of things there about responding to debt and credit, trying to get rid of some of the organisations that suck money out of communities, advice and support, the need to sustain those organisations that are responding to people's need, working out what to do about food banks and why people are there, and then finally, local authorities' own responsibilities. Local authorities have been given certain benefits to administer, like council tax benefit, local welfare assistance schemes, and discretionary housing payments to respond to things like benefit cap and bedroom tax. And these vary around the country. Some have done really brilliant things, some have done not so brilliant things, but it is something that local authorities can do. And then there's all sorts of things to do with the community. I've put here vibrant, no basket case. This is something that came out of the commission that I was on. Very strongly, people wanted to see their communities as part of the solution and wanting to be consulted. They wanted to see equalities going wider than just income and looking at disability, race, gender, and all those things as well. So both income and all sorts of inequalities. And so this kind of list responds to that, supporting grassroots communities, responding to fear of crime, traffic calming, and so on. And not regarding communities as a problem, but actually as having many of the solutions. So just quickly at the end, this is our website, stuff that we produce about what a good local welfare assistance scheme would look like. We have a toolkit for local authorities in how to respond to some of these issues, and stuff about hearing the voices of young people about what they want. So finally, my point is we know child poverty can be reduced. We've done it here in the UK. So the failure to act is actually hugely expensive. We know if governments do the right thing, child poverty can come down. If they do the wrong thing, the opposite happens. There are all sorts of other underlying issues that need to be tackled, and I know Graeme is going to talk about employment and the housing and childcare, and all these issues need to be addressed, but you can't ignore family incomes. So my little ray of sunshine at the end is people are really bothered about this. This is a poll that Mori carries out, where people are just asked what they think is the most important issue facing Britain today. And the proportion saying the biggest issue is poverty and inequality is going through the roof. Thank you very much.
I'm Tom Hilly. I'm a councillor in Kings Park Ward, which has 43% of its children living in poverty. And I'm also a member of the Children and Young People Scrutiny panel here in Hackney. It's clear from the presentation that there is so much of this is due to the kind of choices that central government are making, but also clearly something that we and our partners can be doing.
Yes.
Councillor Linden in her introduction talked about the work that Hackney is doing to help parents into work. But I think it was the Joseph Rowntree Foundation research that was out today that showed that over the past year, I think it was 2/3 of new entrants into work over the past year had entered jobs that were paying below the living wage, and so wouldn't have been able to overcome those problems of child poverty. So from the perspective of a council's role and a council's partner's role, I'd be interested in perspectives on whether there are things that we can be doing to help make sure actually people are not just entering work, but they're able to progress within work, whether there is more that areas can do to kind of shape their local economies, and obviously that's not just something that is within the council's control, but as an area we can shape that economy to mean that those opportunities are present. Are the pitfalls that we should avoid? And it's probably a topic that other speakers will touch on, but so particularly from the perspective of parents and of families and child poverty. Parents
into work. This is an absolutely crucial issue, I think. And my concern, I mentioned second earners. The Institute for Fiscal Studies reckons that the only real improvements that have taken place over the last 30 years in family incomes have come from second earners. And it's reckoned, the Resolution Foundation reckon that there's about 1 million missing women in the labour market compared to our sort of comparable countries in the EU. And if both partners in a couple work, the chances of being out of poverty are significantly raised. So if everyone's unemployed, the child poverty rate's about 71%. If one person is in full-time work, it drops to about 30%. But if both work, even if it's just one full-time and one part-time, it drops to 8%. So it really has a significant difference on families. The problem is, as you say, a lot of the jobs available don't pay enough, they're insecure, people find themselves falling back onto benefits, and they find it very difficult to progress in work. So there's something there about the quality of jobs. So what I was saying about local authorities in their tendering behaviour, I think is significant here, because if you can take the jobs which traditionally advertise as just full-time and make them also available on a more flexible basis, then you can get people into jobs that aren't just very low-paid jobs that very often mothers do to fit around school hours, but you can get them into decent jobs where there's a chance of progression. And there's more that can be done. I mean, obviously, working with chambers of commerce, working with business organisations to educate them about the kind of jobs that they need to be trying to create, and also, you know, things to do with training and progression. Those are things that can be addressed locally. So I think there's, you know, a lot of positive work that could be done around that area.
Hello, my name is Tony Bird and I work in this borough in housing. You made no mention about changing the government. Let's be clear about it. The Tories don't give a shit about poor people. You need to change the government, and there are important things that people need to be doing to press to alleviate poverty. I want to mention just one of them tonight. There is a move in the Labour housing group nationally to change affordable rents to the social rent level. The Labour government comes through, and that's one of the 50 policies they've put forward to Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband has signed the programme, but it's not official Labour Party policy yet. That will do a huge amount. We are suggesting that the large housing associations, you need to be very discerning about who you work with in this borough, particularly look at their rent setting policies and their attitude about converting social rents to affordable rents. Politics is about priorities, and I heard it last week about the Scottish Nationalists, what they're planning. They are planning to take 30 Labour seats in Scotland, and their main hook is going to be Trident. They're saying that Trident is your dirty English thing here, and we'll be against it there. So, we lose possibly the opportunity to have a majority Labour government because of a huge £100 billion programme. It's about priorities there. Who are we fighting against? Are we trying to keep the Romanians out by keeping Trident? I don't know. The very last thing I'll say is 200,000 homes they're promising a year. It's a sham promise at this stage, because it could be £200,000 of rich people's homes there. What you need to be pressing for is how many of those are council homes or social rent homes there. And you need to get Ed Balls to move away from committing a new government to just be maintaining the Tory spending limits for the next 2 years. Because that's really going to mean you'll have no new social housing homes.
A lot of the changes in what's happening to the benefits and tax credits are about the coalition's austerity strategy, but they also have competing priorities. So there's something that universal credit, the new benefit that's supposed to be replacing all the means-tested benefits, does have some poverty-fighting potential. It would have been quite poverty-reducing when it was first designed. It would have reduced child poverty by about 300,000, but that's now fallen to about 100,000 because of all their own cuts. So there's a problem about one side trying to do something helpful and another side actually cutting off their legs while they're trying to do it. So universal credit now doesn't have the poverty-reducing potential that it once had, but that could be fixed. And housing, one of the things, I think you quite rightly raised the issue of rents. It's now the case that housing benefit doesn't address real rents anymore. It addresses imaginary rents, local housing allowances that have been cut because of various factors like the bedroom tax. Increasingly, people aren't getting help with their housing costs that actually meet their rent. So some ideas, I mean, I know this is not popular even in the housing sector to propose this, but we used to have rent controls. And some idea of actually limiting rents while you go through a period when you're building more houses, because ultimately having more houses is going to bring down the price. But in the meantime, it's certainly worth looking at turning so-called affordable rents back into social rents.
My name's Sarah Young. I wanted to ask you something specifically about spending in education. You gave some really helpful ideas about how that will propel education. I'm interested in your ideas on how the specific pupil premium funding would be used to help.
Spending in education, again, there's lots of really good practice going on around this. I think when pupil premium first came in, schools had no idea what they were meant to be doing with it, and there was no guidance supplied with it. But since then, I think the government's got a bit better at telling people what they can do with it. So there's lots of different things people are doing. Some schools are targeting particularly disadvantaged children and working on improving their educational attainment, on looking at kind of literacy and numeracy and so on. They're using it to spend on some of the schemes that they were losing money on before. But one of the problems with it is, and I'm sure you recognise, that schools have lost a lot of money too, even though education's been protected. And so in some schools it was plugging the gap. So, but there is a lot that could be done with that.
Gary Saunders, Lansdowne Drive. How can it be right that the private sector can charge rent at £395 a week and no politicians seem to want to control the huge increase in private rent costs? And if you're looking at poverty, boroughs like Hackney are forced to house people in Southend with a young woman from Sri Lanka with 2 children. She's forced, with a one-way ticket, 2 children on the age of 8 are forced to move to Southend. She's got no resources, no work. She's been given indefinite leave to stay, and that indefinite leave to stay is conditional on her having not being entitled to housing benefit. You are condemning a woman like that, poor woman, to complete poverty. That's outrageous.
One of the list of things that good local authorities, that I said good local authorities were looking at how to get more affordable housing. It's not just an issue for local authorities, it's also an issue for national government, because our benefit system is having to respond to enormously high rents, very low wages and very high childcare costs. So all of this is having to be subsidised out of the social security system, which wasn't intended for that purpose, arguably. Private sector rents, particularly in this area, are huge. And if I can relate this back to child poverty rates in London are pretty average until you take account of housing costs. and then they balloon to the highest rates in the country. So it's housing costs quite clearly that are driving many families into poverty. So I'm not at all surprised that housing is such an important issue for people here.
Thank you very much, Alison, for a fantastic presentation. My name's Tina Lashmore. I'm a resident here. I've been involved locally in campaigning, and people have already mentioned about controlling the housing market. It seems as though the German housing model runs on protected markets, whereas our housing markets here are open markets. And it would seem to me, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we should just take the German model and modify it for Hackney. And there you would then control the rents, release local economy, release funds for the family so that they can afford to buy the things that they need locally. And I can't see anything but benefit approach to that strategy. What do you say about that, please, Alison?
You asked about the German housing model. I'm afraid I'm not an expert on Germany, but I'm sure there are plenty of places that we could look at because we know that there are different models of controlled rents in different parts of the world. Definitely worth having a look at.
My name's Wendy Pettifer. I've lived and worked in this borough for over 35 years, raised my children who can't afford to live here. I'm the senior solicitor at Hackney Law Centre, and my speciality is housing. I think we've seen from the floor already that although child poverty is linked to housing, it's housing that people are most worried about in this borough. I would say on child poverty, I act for a lot of irregular migrant women and children who don't feature in these statistics at all, who are completely destitute and who are or are not supported by social services. But it's the effect of the benefit cap on housing that concerns people. People, even if they're working, that's no solution. I was on duty in the county court last week. There were so many evictions going on, possession orders, that people were sitting on the floor. I had to defend 2 women with between 4 and 6 children who were being made homeless by social housing landlords just because of the benefit cap, through no fault of their own, and they were both working. I'm not in the Labour Party, but those of you who are must campaign and lobby the Labour Party to take a stronger stance on benefit. We must repeal this legislation if we're actually serious about reducing poverty in our borough. I've lived round here 35 years. I see all these young, rich people living in gated communities. They put no money into our community. We must find a way of increasing their council tax. We must get some money off them.
We've been doing work in food banks in Tower Hamlets, and through a combination of sanctions, benefit delays, benefit cap, people are facing destitution. People have literally nothing to live on, particularly where benefit sanctions are concerned. They don't even know why the sanction's been made, what they have to do to get rid of it, and even if they do the thing that was requested, the sanction stays anyway. It's not sensitive to your behaviour. It's a fixed length of time. So we're driving more and more people into absolute destitution at the moment, and this desperately needs a national response. It's not just about child poverty, as you say, it's also about mentally ill people, people with disabilities, women fleeing domestic violence. The benefit cap alone, we've seen about 70% of the cases we've seen on benefit cap are single parents, and they're being capped even where they're not even required to work. They have children under the age of 12 months, they've got babies, and they're being capped nevertheless. I mean, this really is a massive crisis that needs a response. You know, and I would agree in repealing some of this legislation.
Thank you, Alison. I think it would be remiss of me not to say that housing is an issue that really does concern all of us as councillors here in Hackney. And I know that my colleague, Councillor Glanville, who's in the room, has been doing an awful lot of work around housing. I speak for all of my colleagues, including my colleague who chairs the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission as well. And also it would be remiss of me not to say that the Community Safety and Social Inclusion Commission has been doing some ongoing work around welfare reform over the past couple of years, as has Councillor Rick Muir on the Governance and Resources Scrutiny Commission. So these are two areas that we are extremely concerned about, and we have been doing a lot of work to try and minimise the impact for people who live here in Hackney and to mitigate against some of the worst effects of the government policies around welfare reform.